Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Good.
Thank you for coming to meet. As you know, I use Hunter's 7 steps to effective lesson planning. So during your lesson, when I came in, your objective was written on the board, and students were actively engaged in the lesson. I came in a little bit after you had started the Do Now review, and I did see an anticipatory set leading into the lesson for today. And one of the things you said were we are going to analyze student work. You said be sure to say who you agree with and why. Your objective and purpose was, like I said, stated on the board. Do you remember what that objective was for the day?
I can't remember particularly, but it was aligned to the fact that the students would be reviewing for 2 days in order to prepare for the quarterly exam. So the gist of the lesson was to have them analyze common errors that they themselves have made throughout the quarter on certain objectives.
Okay. Do you feel like that objective was met by the end of the lesson?
I think so. The students were definitely engaged and interested in seeing their own mistakes versus how it should be answered and how often that does happen, because a lot of students were honest with each other and saying, oh, I make that mistake, oh, I make this mistake, which I think was really great, and it set them in a positive mindset going into their quarterly exam.
Okay. How did you determine which questions or which types of questions you would put so that students wouldn't make those same mistakes?
I definitely used data from previous assessments, so I pulled questions almost exactly like the ones they had seen on quizzes or unit tests, and pulled student examples from that. So a common error I saw maybe in domain and range is the student mixing the two. So their error analysis portion of independent practice would be that sort of example where they switch up domain and range, and they need to see the error and know why it's the error.
Okay. Any other errors that you saw that you pointed out specifically in that lesson?
We also talked a lot about function notation, which isn't a lot of algebraic math, but a lot of just how to write math, which sometimes the students struggle with a lot too. So for them to see student work that shows correct notation was also really important.
Okay. So your objective and purpose was there, and you were able to explain that to me as well just now. One of the things with modeling, since it was like a review, students were more so working independently, and then you would come back together and review together to see which student had the error and who you agree with and why. One of the key things that you did during the lesson was writing down the key reminders for students. I believe it was written in the packet already. How effective, or what was the effect that something like that would have for students?
I think sometimes often students will hear something, but they aren't listening to what you're saying. So having the students actually pause and write something down will help to internalize what you are saying. And so you can pause, have students write a key takeaway or key understanding, and then afterwards have someone repeat it so they've heard it twice and written it once. So hopefully it will stick a little bit more in that way.
Okay. You were also checking for understanding, so along with those key reminders, you had students state argument for why they agree with the specific student while analyzing. They agreed and disagreed, and then you would say things like defend your answer choice. What's the effect of having students defend their answer choice and not just say I agree with student A or I agree with student B?
I definitely think that's effective in preparation, especially for exams, because questions won't always look the same. So if a student can answer the question, that's one thing, but if a student understands why the question is correct or incorrect, it shows that they have a much deeper understanding of that topic and not just of the question.
Because a lot of times we want them to take the question, like the skills they've learned, and then apply it to something completely different.
Yeah.
So that's good. In the guided practice, you guided students to be able to break down responses, and also that was during guided practice, and then also during independent practice, the students were working independently. What ways did you use to engage the students during the lesson?
So while the students were working independently, I monitored some of their work, and so I saw one student who was passionate about an incorrect answer. I found a student who was passionate about the correct answer, and knowing that when I brought the class back together, I would call on those two students, I knew that they both thought they were right with passion, and so they would be willing to defend their answers, and we could have a really great discussion based on who was incorrect and why. And so just knowing which students to call on sometimes will help increase engagement.
Okay. I noticed during at one point there was like, I'm not sure if that was the two, those were the two students you called on, but there was like a intense, not disagreement, but like an intense discussion about the lesson and why they agree with a certain student, and the students were defending their answers and clearing up any misconceptions. Does that happen often within, like, in your class?
I wouldn't say often. I'd say it depends on the topic and the student. Some students are not very vocal about or very willing to volunteer for debates because they're afraid of being wrong. But I think that when you are able to start the class, especially a lesson like this, off with two students who you know are very outgoing and are willing to speak, and one of them will be wrong, it lets the class know that being wrong is okay and that that's fine, that, you know, at some point in the lesson they should participate whether they know they're right or incorrect.
Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't know.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. So how do you think you can engage those students and possibly show them, like, okay, it's okay to be incorrect?
I think definitely using maybe a scenario where the students are working with their partner, so they can still debate with their partner, and they maybe aren't comfortable speaking whole group. If you just have them debate with their partners, they still get to express their voice, but maybe not in such a with such a wide audience that it like will intimidate them. So maybe just having them turn with their partners and talk or something like that.
And you did use a lot of turn and talks during the lesson. What was the effect of those turn and talks on your overall lesson?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, it definitely gave me a hint on who I should call on for the debate, for the whole class debate, because it let me know whether or not they could vocalize their defense for their answer. So I could listen to their turn talks while they were doing it, and I was able to pick two students that I knew would be able to vocalize their opinion.
Right. Did you make any adjustments to your original plan during the lesson?
Yeah, I definitely had to stop the class at least once or twice on a question that I didn't anticipate the whole class getting wrong. So there were a couple of questions where I found in a pool of 10, one student had the right answer. So I found that in that moment it was best that I model that question as opposed to let them keep going down the wrong path, which is something with review lessons that you don't always anticipate. That's, I mean, the purpose of a review lesson, to see what they do or do not know. So definitely knowing when to bring the class back together in order for me to model the question. So knowing when to do that.
So how did you determine whether you should model the question or just have a discussion?
I think with questions that build on both skill and knowledge and are aligned to whatever assessment we have coming up the most. So our quarterly had a lot of variable solution questions. So if I noticed that students were making errors when solving for one variable, I knew that that was such a high priority skill that I needed to stop the class and address that, which goes, of course, back into your planning. When you have student work, you know which questions are of highest rigor and leverage that you really need to focus on.
Were students making those types of errors before the review?
Yes, so that's the kind of question that is on there, so that they you sort of want them to make the mistake so you can come back whole group. So like fractions is something students really struggle with, so making sure fractions are on the review so that they know that they're not going away and they know to see them again in on assessment.
Okay. Do you think your review was effective in response to like the fractions and not mixing up variables?
I think that I was able to hit some of my targets, but not all. I think fractions is just one of those things that students struggle with long term, so it's definitely something that will need to be spiraled in again and again. But I definitely think that we did better with functions, and that was great to see them show progression in.
Okay. How do you think we can, or you can, work with fractions and not making it such a daunting task for students?
I think trying to use 1 to 2 methods, because there are so many ways in which to solve for variables with fractions and things like that. So sticking to a 1 or 2 method to solving helps decrease student anxiety about that. Because if you say, well, use the skill we learned yesterday, and you constantly refer to one way in which to do something, that'll help them internalize like using least common multiple or least common denominator, something that if they hear it enough, they'll hopefully use muscle memory to solve.
Right. Could you give me an example of a problem with a fraction that the students are struggling with?
If we have x over 2 equals 4, students will struggle on how to isolate x. So in this scenario, it would be important for them to understand that right now x is being divided by 2, and they would have to do an inverse operation of multiplying by 2 on both the left and the right in order to isolate for x.
Okay.
So just modeling key vocabulary like inverse operation, so it lets them know like, well, if this is division, because it's a fraction, then how do I get rid of a fraction? Because it's division, inverse of that would be multiplication.
Right.
So modeling strong vocab and just using that throughout all of the future lessons to come.
Okay. Do they recognize that this is division?
Most
X over 2?
Yeah, most of them do because they see that x over 2 is very different than 2x.
Right, okay.
So they have started to visualize. They just often struggle with how to get rid of that denominator in a sense.
Do they divide by 2?
Yes, some of them will divide by 2. Or multiply by 4. Something weird. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Or some of them will do
Right.
like a guess and check. They'll try like a bunch of different x values until they find the one that divided by 2 will give them 4.
Right. Which works in this case,
Yeah.
but like if there's a larger problem, then that can be difficult. If
Yeah.
there's a longer problem, rather. Okay. So what was it about functions that the students were struggling with?
Well, functions can be represented in so many different ways. It can be an equation, a table, a graph, a chart. It can be represented in so many different ways that sometimes students struggle to see that all of those are representing a function.
Right.
And so making sure that they understand that if you want f of 2, then you could use an equation, a graph, or a table. And they need to understand that there's 3 different methods for each, or 1 method per different representation.
Okay.
So they struggle with understanding that all of that is functions
Right.
and not just
Okay.
a table.
Okay. And I noticed in your lesson you did something where you said I'm a function or I'm X, and then you like grabbed on a hold to someone else. Can you explain what that was?
Yeah, so students still struggle with understanding that a function is a relation where each input has only one output.
Okay.
And so I tried to model that physically for them by saying if I am an input, and then I grabbed a student's hand, I said I am only allowed to have one friendship.
Okay.
And so I said, well, if I already have a friendship with this person as the input, am I allowed to have a friendship with someone else?
Right.
And so the appropriate response would be no. And so them seeing me being pulled in 2 different directions is hopefully a good visual for them to see that, like, I cannot be pulled in 2 directions.
Wow.
I should only be pulled in 1 direction.
Okay. How do you think that was an effective representation of functions?
Yeah, because I didn't even bring it up during the review lesson. Another student brought it up and said that's how they remembered. So
Oh, wow.
it was great that it stuck with someone and they brought it up during the review when they
Okay.
were defending one of their answers.
So did you show them that first?
Yeah, I-
during the initial lesson?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I did that during the initial lesson.
But it's still good that a student remembered because
Yep.
we want them to
Stick.
take right. We want those things to stick. We want them to take the mnemonics or the visuals or the representations that we give them, and just make them stick.
Yeah.
So thinking about how you were able to make that stick with functions, do you think there's something we could do with fractions?
Man, fractions are just that thing that I think
Right.
all students just dislike. I think for that, it would just have to be consistency with practice.
Okay.
So even if a lesson in the future isn't centered around fraction, making sure we throw a problem or 2 in there that involves fractions.
Okay.
And like I said before, trying to stick to 1 to 2 ways in which we can teach students to solve, and just keep spiraling that into homeworks and lessons and as much as we can.
Okay. Did you have an exit ticket this day, or?
No, the exit ticket wasn't about any material. It was just a student reflection on material they felt they needed to still work on before their quarterly.
What were your? Did you collect that one, or did you just
yes.
have them? Okay.
Yes, I collected.
What were their responses? Like, what are some of the things that they think they're struggling with?
Domain, again, has always been an issue with them. But most of them have understood now that domain is synonymous with x values, x-axis, and inputs. But being that you can represent a domain in interval notation, in equality notation, or in a list, they are now struggling with how to write the domain. they now understand what domain is, but now they need to write it down, and they struggle with knowing where the less than or equal to, a bracket, a parentheses. Now we're in that scenario with how do we write it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some ways that you are, or, well, I guess they've already taken their exam, but we know that the quarterlies build on each other.
Right.
So what are some ways to possibly,
Address.
yes, thank you, address this issue that students are having with domain?
I definitely want to include some signage in the classroom
Okay.
that I can refer to constantly if domain does come back up in a future review lesson, which I'm sure it will.
Mm-hmm.
Having something that they can reference. So if in class they're ever a little confused, they can reference that signage or that poster or whatever
Mm-hmm.
to give themselves quick reminders.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the visuals, just being able to always see something
Mm-hmm.
really helps, because we want them to remember the vocabulary
Yeah.
and know it off the top of their head, but realistically it doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
So I've also seen that having the signage up and
Yeah.
just having that vocabulary is very helpful for students to quickly look at,
Yeah.
and then hopefully over time it just sticks with them.
Yep.
So they won't have to reference the signage. They'll just know how to
Yeah.
notate domain.
Yeah, and hopefully just a picture of that poster remains in their brain,
Right.
and they can like see it
Mhm.
without having to see the poster.
Right.
Just like a photographic sort of
Mhm.
memory.
And that also is similar to how the student remembered the hand thing.
Mhm.
So if that student remembers that representation, also having like the visual signage in the classroom
Right.
will hopefully imprint a picture in their minds, and they will always remember exactly how to write
Yeah.
domain.
Definitely agree.
Were there any other topics listed?
There was a topic about, let me see, identifying the slope and y-intercept of a line, which is something students enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
They enjoy, I think, linear functions because it's something they've seen before, but now understanding a graph in context. So if I have two lines that intersect, that intersection point, what does that mean?
Okay.
So knowing what that means, or if one graph starts at y equals 0 and one graph starts at y equals 4,
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean? If maybe we're talking about a race, right? So like in context, what does that mean? Like, well, that would mean that one person started at 0 and one person started 4 feet ahead of the other person.
Okay.
So identifying y-intercept and using it in the context of a word problem, which wasn't that much of an emphasis for this review lesson, but will definitely come into play as we move forward with quarter 2 and more analyzation of word problems.
Okay. How do you think you'll be able to tackle the slope and y-intercept as you move into quarter 2? What are some effective instructional practices you can use?
I think definitely positively framing new material. So saying, well, like, I know we've done really well with slope and y-intercept and writing the equation of a line, so let's bump it up a notch and we're going to try something new with word problems. So trying to instill that confidence that that was a previously mastered area for them that we're going to build on now.
Okay.
So it doesn't create any anxiety about it being new material. And I think being very intentional in my models during the lesson so that students can use that as a reference. So what I said and what I did.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thinking about the fact that this is the end of quarter 1, how do you, what do I say? What are some changes that you want to make in your classroom moving into quarter 2?
I definitely am looking forward to changing student seats based on the results from the quarter 1 exam.
Okay.
Because I think it'll be a more accurate depiction of student achievement. So looking to pair students accordingly. So maybe one student who performs really well but doesn't speak, maybe pairing that student with a low student who does speak, and maybe they can push each other academically and socially, and using student seating to benefit off of peers who are willing to help one another.
Okay. And since the lesson that I observed was a review lesson for the exam, how do you feel that the students did on that specific exam?
Some students were very impressive. Some students didn't perform as well as I would like, and others were about exactly where I wanted them. For this rigorous exam, I'd say they are exactly where they should be. Still making some errors on what I anticipated, like domain and fractions.
Okay.
Which is fine because it's what I expected. It wasn't an alarming error that I didn't see coming. But I think that right now they're where they need to be. There wasn't any alarming scores. It was more or less where we expected them that they should be.
Okay. So you said you'll use those scores along with just how, like, the personality of the students,
Right.
so change their seats so that students can be more engaged. So to what extent did your classroom procedures during quarter one, student conduct, and your use of physical space contribute to student learning?
I really like that the students sit in pairs because they are so young. They still struggle sometimes with self-control and speaking.
Okay.
Whereas seniors can be seated in pairs in quads because they can control themselves and not talk to their peers. I think that the pairs, seating the students in pairs has done a lot of good for the classroom culture because they still have the freedom to speak to their peer, but it's only one person as opposed to 3 different opportunities to speak. It's just with one person. So if your partner's ignoring you, you don't have anyone to talk to, as opposed to sitting in a quad where you have 3 different chances to talk to someone else. So I think that's definitely contributed positively. Yeah, I think that's been the best contribution.
Okay. So as we move forward and we think about the 2 areas of 3 or 4? Well, domain is encompassing in functions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have domain, no, we have functions,
Mm-hmm.
slope and y-intercept, and fractions.
Yeah.
Right? Yes. As you, along with thinking about classroom procedures and seating changes and quarter one grades, how can you, in your actual lesson, focus on slope and y-intercept, functions, and fractions? Like, what are some ways to effectively bring these into upcoming lessons or spiraling in or something like that? Like, what are some?
I think I'm definitely going to use some homework for students to use to get more practice in, and then once I get the homework back, I can use that as analysis for what I want to see and do with the students. And sometimes I feel students are more comfortable working on math problems at home. They don't feel as pressured by a time limit in class.
Okay.
Or being singled out because they're wrong or something like that. So I want to use homework data to see how students perform. And then once I get it, I can hopefully look at it before we meet in class and maybe showcase a student who is doing really well with fractions and what methods they're using to do that.
Okay. So before we go, I just want to point out some key things that I saw during this past, the past time I came in to observe you. Your students were really excited to learn, and they were eager to participate. Hands went up after each question. It was about 10 or 15 hands, so that shows that it shows that your students are excited about math and excited about participating and engaging in discussion. Some of the things that we've already pointed out, you included reminders for how to find specific pieces of the function, the real life representation, for input and output to determine if a relationship is an actual function. And you also push for vocabulary during your lesson, which, like you said before, when it comes to students recognizing how to list the domain or just having that picture in their head, like, what's the effect of constantly pushing for the math vocabulary?
Definitely, I think as math gets more rigorous, there are a lot more context clues in the questions, and especially in calculus, like words like increasing, decreasing. And a math problem will never say, does this function go up? Like, that's not what it would say. It would say, is this function increasing? So although the students will maybe think it goes up, we need them to know that it means increasing and not use such common, vocab. So building that so that when they see more rigorous math, they understand it and they're not thrown off by seeing the word increasing on an exam.
Yeah, so that's one really effective thing that I constantly see and hear when I'm in your classroom pushing for vocabulary. So that's good. Any questions for me?
Um, did it seem like students were on task?
Yes. They as soon as you sent them into independent practice, they began writing or appeared to be writing. And like I said, they were eager to not only participate but also to get to work. There were a few. There was one student. I don't know his name. He was sitting closest to me. I had to go over and tap his desk to wake him up.
Oh, yes.
It was while you were aggressively
Yes.
monitoring, so it was
Yes. And ironically, he scored the highest on the quarterly exam.
interesting.
Yes, I think with him, he does so well, and he moves at such a fast pace, that he gets a little bored. And so he'll think like, oh, we're going over this question.
Sorry.
It's okay. He'll think like, oh, she's going over this question that I already know how to do.
Okay.
And so he'll wander and just get a little sleepy because he's bored.
What are some things that you've done to possibly engage him? Since we know he's bored in class.
Yeah, maybe like pass out the next sheet
Okay.
or just small tasks to keep him back when he needs to be, or I'll let him move on to a next section so he's not
Okay.
just sitting there. So pushing him, I say like, I'll give you permission to start your homework, like since you have it in front of you, like go ahead.
Okay.
Or some small things to just make sure he's using his time productively.
Did he get an A in your class?
I don't know. I'd have to check the final grades, but he
Okay.
did get a 93 in the quarterly. So
Before the curve?
after the curve.
Okay. That's
But
still
still
good.
very
yeah,
impressive.
that's really good.
Yeah.
Just curious. Yeah. So continue to try to engage him
Yeah.
as best as possible. Yeah, I also have a student that is high skilled, so he's always passing out things because he just moves really quickly, and yeah, we don't want him to get bored in class.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought of any other methods to keep him engaged?
Yeah, I've tried to include more questions on the worksheet that are more rigorous, so it will take him longer, or
Okay.
a stretch question, or just asking him questions sometimes that are higher level thinking to see what he says and let him fixate on that for a second.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Do you have any other questions?
No.
No? Okay. So thank you for taking this time out, and as we talked about before, as we move on, we're going to focus on functions, slope and y-intercept, and fractions.
Yep.
And I think during this meeting, hopefully you were able to develop some ideas as to how to make these three things stronger in your classroom moving forward.
Definitely.
All right, thank you.